The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the mountain pass, each flake catching the amber glow of lantern light that spilled from the cabin windows below. Inside, Linda Mendoza pressed her back against the rough wooden door, her heart hammering as voices rose in anger just beyond the thin walls. The sound of boots on the porch made her breath catch, and she knew that everything she had fought for, everything Edward Reed had given her, hung in the balance of this single, terrible night. "She's in there with him," came Thomas Cruise's voice, sharp with malice. "The mountain man's whore. Time we showed them both what decent folk think of their kind." Linda's hands trembled as she reached for the rifle Edward had taught her to use, the weight of it both foreign and familiar in her grip. 6 months ago, she had stood on an auction block in the town square, broken and desperate, sold like cattle to pay her father's debts. Now she stood ready to defend the only home she had ever known, the only man who had ever seen her as more than property to be bought and traded. The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the promise of violence. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the cabin, Edward Reed moved like a shadow between the trees, his presence both protection and target. The townspeople had come for them both, driven by gossip and hatred, unable to understand what they had built together in this wild, unforgiving place. Linda closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the day it all began, when she had first seen the mountain man step forward at the auction, his silver coins glinting in the harsh sunlight. She had expected cruelty, had braced herself for the worst kind of ownership. Instead, she had found something else entirely, something that would change not just her life, but the very heart of the man who had claimed her. The door rattled under a heavy fist, and Linda's eyes snapped open. The time for memories had passed. Tonight she would discover whether the strength Edward had helped her find was enough to save them both. But to understand how Linda Mendoza came to stand in that cabin, rifle in hand and ready to fight for her life, one must return to a different kind of darkness, to a day when hope seemed as distant as the mountain peaks that would one day shelter her. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the town square of Cedar Falls, its rays offering no comfort to the woman who stood upon the wooden platform, her wrists bound and her head held high despite the shame that burned in her chest. Linda Mendoza had not slept in 3 days, not since the sheriff had come to her father's farm with the papers that would change everything. "Debt," he had said. Unpaid loans that stretched back years, interest compounded until the sum had grown beyond any hope of repayment. "Lot 17, called the auctioneer, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd like the crack of a whip. "One female, age 22, healthy and strong, suitable for domestic work, farm labor, or other arrangements as the buyer sees fit." Linda forced herself to look out over the faces below, searching for some sign of mercy, some hint of kindness in the eyes that stared back at her. She found only curiosity, calculation, and in some cases, a hunger that made her stomach turn. These were her neighbors, people she had known since childhood, and yet they looked at her now as if she were nothing more than livestock to be evaluated and purchased. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The bidding began slowly, tentatively, as if the crowd needed time to adjust to the reality of what they were witnessing. Thomas Cruise, the town's wealthiest merchant, raised his hand first, his thin lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. $50, he called out, and Linda felt her heart sink. She knew Cruise's reputation, knew the fate that awaited any woman unlucky enough to fall under his control. 60, came another voice, and then another, as the price climbed steadily higher. Linda tried to block out the numbers, tried to think of something else, anything else, but the reality of her situation pressed down upon her like a physical weight. She was being sold, reduced to a commodity in a transaction that would determine the rest of her life. The crowd had grown restless, the bidding fierce, when a new voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. $200. A hush fell over the square, and Linda's eyes searched for the source of the bid. At the back of the crowd, she saw him for the first time, a figure that seemed to exist apart from the others, untouched by their fever and greed. Edward Reed stood with his shoulders squared and his dark eyes fixed upon her, his presence commanding despite his simple clothes and weathered appearance. Linda had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew of the mountain man who lived in the high country, who came to town only when necessity demanded it, who spoke little and trusted fewer. They said he was dangerous, unpredictable, a man who had turned his back on civilization and embraced the wild. Looking at him now, Linda could see why the townspeople whispered. There was something untamed about Edward Reed, something that suggested he answered to no law but his own. 200 going once, the auctioneer called, his voice betraying his surprise at the unexpected sum. Thomas Cruise's face had darkened, his earlier confidence replaced by frustration as he realized he had been outbid by a man he considered beneath his station. 250, Cruise snapped, his voice tight with anger. Edward Reed's response was immediate and final. $500. Gold. Is. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, and Linda felt her knees weaken. $500 was more money than most of these people saw in a year, an impossible sum that spoke of wealth hidden away in the mountains, of secrets that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Linda's fate was sealed. She belonged now to the mountain man, to Edward Reed, to a future she could not begin to imagine. As the crowd began to disperse, their excitement giving way to disappointed grumbling, Linda watched her new owner approach the platform with steady, measured steps. Up close, Edward Reed was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame lean but powerful, shaped by years of hard living in the wilderness. His hair was dark, touched with silver at the temples, and his face bore the lines of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. But it was his eyes that captured Linda's attention, dark brown and surprisingly gentle, holding depths she had not expected to find. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice low and rough from disuse. He reached up to help her down from the platform, his touch careful and respectful, so different from the rough handling she had endured from the sheriff and his men. Linda found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What happens now?" Edward Reed studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Now you come with me," he said. "Up to the mountain. There's work to be done, and winter's coming fast." As they walked through the town toward the general store, Linda became aware of the stares that followed them, the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when they drew near. The mountain man seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on the task at hand as he purchased supplies with the same methodical precision he had shown at the auction. "You'll need warmer clothes," he said, selecting a heavy wool coat from the store's limited selection, "and boots that won't fall apart in the snow." He paid for everything without complaint, counting out gold coins that gleamed dully in the lamplight. Victoria Gomez, the storekeeper's wife, watched the transaction with barely concealed disapproval. "Edward Reed," she said, her voice sharp with judgment. "I hope you know what you're doing, taking on a woman like that. People are talking already." Edward's eyes shifted to Victoria, and something in his gaze made her step back involuntarily. "People always talk, Victoria. Doesn't make what they say true." Outside the store, a wagon waited, loaded with supplies and pulled by 2 sturdy horses that stamped impatiently in the dust. Edward helped Linda up onto the seat beside him, his hands steady and sure, before taking up the reins with practiced ease. As they left Cedar Falls behind, Linda watched the familiar buildings grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. The road, such as it was, wound steadily upward, following the contours of the land as it climbed toward the distant peaks. "How far?" Linda asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Far enough," Edward replied, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Far enough that the town's noise can't reach us." The wagon creaked and swayed as they climbed, the horses breathing hard in the thin air. Linda found herself studying her companion, trying to understand the man who had purchased her freedom, or perhaps simply traded one form of captivity for another. He drove with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and turn in the road, his hands gentle on the reins, his attention divided between the path and the surrounding wilderness. "You're wondering why I bought you," Edward said suddenly, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Linda started, surprised by his directness. "Yes," she admitted. $500 is a lot of money for someone like me." Edward was quiet for so long that Linda began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "I've been alone on the mountain for 8 years, he said. "It's hard country, and it's getting harder. A man needs help to survive up there, especially with winter coming. So I'm to be your servant, Linda said, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. You're to be my partner, Edward corrected, glancing at her with those dark, thoughtful eyes. If you choose to be. The work's hard, but it's honest. And no one will hurt you up there, not while I draw breath. Something in his tone, a quiet certainty that brooked no argument, made Linda believe him. For the first time since the sheriff had come to her father's farm, she felt a small flicker of hope kindle in her chest. The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached Edward's cabin, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Linda had expected, built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked, with a stone chimney that spoke of warmth and comfort within. A small barn stood nearby, along with other outbuildings that suggested a well-established homestead. It's beautiful, Linda said, and meant it. After the cramped squalor of her father's failing farm, the mountain cabin seemed like a palace. Edward helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief but gentle. It's home, he said simply. Has been for 8 years now. I built it myself, every log and stone. Inside, the cabin was even more impressive. The main room was spacious and well-appointed, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and furniture that, while simple, was clearly crafted with care and skill. Books lined shelves along the walls. More books than Linda had ever seen in one place, and oil paintings hung here and there, depicting mountain scenes that captured the wild beauty of the high country. You read, Linda observed, running her fingers along the spines of the volumes. I do, Edward confirmed. Long winters give a man time to think, and books help with the thinking. He moved to the fireplace and began building a fire, his movements economical and practiced. There's a room for you upstairs, he said without looking up. Your own space, with a lock on the door, if it makes you feel safer. Linda felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the simple kindness of the gesture, or perhaps it was the realization that she had expected so much worse. Thank you, she whispered. Or Edward straightened, brushing dust from his hands. No need for thanks. We're partners now, remember? Partners look out for each other. That first night on the mountain was unlike anything Linda had ever experienced. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional call of a night bird. She lay in her small but comfortable room, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been a prisoner, bound and helpless. Tonight she was free, or as free as anyone could be in such circumstances. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of her father's farm, of the life she had lost and would never see again. She woke to the sound of Edward moving about downstairs, the familiar noises of someone preparing for the day's work. When she descended to the main room, she found him at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands and another waiting for her. Sleep well? He asked, his voice carrying none of the awkwardness she might have expected. Well enough, Linda replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was strong and bitter, but it chased away the last remnants of sleep and dream. Today we start your education, Edward said, rising from the table. Mountain living isn't like town living. Up here, a mistake can kill you, so you need to learn fast and learn well. The education Edward spoke of proved to be comprehensive and demanding. He showed her how to read the weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals, how to identify the signs that warned of an approaching storm. He taught her to use the rifle that hung above the fireplace, patiently correcting her stance and breathing until she could hit a target at 50 yards with reasonable consistency. Why do I need to know this? Linda asked one afternoon as she reloaded the rifle under his watchful eye. Because up here, you can't depend on anyone but yourself, Edward replied. I might be hunting when trouble comes calling. You need to be able to protect yourself and the homestead. The days settled into a rhythm that was both foreign and oddly comforting. Linda learned to tend the animals in Edward's small barn, to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter ahead, to read the subtle signs that marked the changing of the seasons. Edward was a patient teacher, never raising his voice or showing frustration when she struggled with a new skill. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking about the day's work or the challenges that lay ahead. Edward proved to be surprisingly well-educated, his conversation ranging from practical matters to philosophy and literature. He had been a different man before coming to the mountain, Linda realized, though he never spoke directly of his past. "You weren't always a mountain man," she said one evening, setting down the book she had been reading. Edward looked up from his own volume, his expression thoughtful. "No," he admitted. "I had a different life once. A wife, a house in town, work that kept me busy, but never satisfied me." "What happened?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "She died," he said finally. "Fever took her one winter, along with the child she was carrying. After that, the town felt like a tomb. I needed space, needed silence, needed to find out who I was when everything I thought I knew was stripped away." Linda felt her heart ache for him, understanding now the source of the sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It was a long time ago," Edward replied, though his voice suggested the wound was still tender. "The mountain helped me heal, gave me purpose again. Now it's giving me something else." "What's that?" Edward's eyes met hers across the firelit room. "A reason to hope, again." The words hung between them, charged with meaning that neither was quite ready to explore. Linda felt her cheeks warm, not from the fire but from something deeper, something that had been growing between them over the weeks of shared work and quiet companionship. As autumn deepened into winter, their partnership evolved into something more complex and precious. Edward never pressed his advantage, never reminded Linda of the circumstances that had brought her to his mountain. Instead, he treated her with a respect and consideration that she had never experienced, even from her own family. The first snow fell on a night in late October, blanketing the world in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Linda stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes dance in the lamplight, and felt a peace she had not known was possible. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Edward said, joining her at the window. "It's like the whole world has been made clean," Linda replied, her breath fogging the glass. "Snow has a way of covering up the ugliness," Edward agreed. "Makes everything look fresh and new, like maybe there's hope for a better tomorrow." Linda turned to look at him, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. "Do you really believe that?" "I'm starting to," Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility, until a log shifted in the fireplace and broke the spell. They stepped apart, both suddenly aware of the dangerous ground they were approaching. Winter deepened around them, sealing the mountain in snow and ice that would not break until spring. The isolation that had once seemed daunting now felt like protection, a barrier between them and a world that had shown them little kindness. They worked together, ate together, shared the long evenings by the fire, and slowly, carefully, began to share their hearts as well. Linda learned that Edward's gruff exterior hid a man of surprising gentleness and depth. He could be tender with an injured animal, patient with a difficult task, thoughtful in his consideration of others. He never raised his voice to her, never made demands that felt unreasonable, never treated her as anything less than an equal partner in their mountain enterprise. For his part, Edward discovered that Linda possessed a strength and resilience that had been hidden beneath the desperation of her circumstances. She learned quickly, worked without complaint, and brought to their isolated world a warmth and grace that had been missing for too long. Her laughter, rare at first but growing more frequent as winter progressed, became the sound he most looked forward to hearing. "You're different than I expected," Linda said one evening as they worked together preparing their evening meal. "Different how?" Edward asked, glancing up from the vegetables he was chopping. "Kinder," Linda said simply. "Gentler. In town they said you were dangerous, unpredictable. They made you sound like some kind of wild animal." Edward's knife paused in its work. "Maybe I was, for a while. Grief can make a man wild, make him forget who he used to be. But you—" He looked at her, his expression soft with something that might have been wonder. "You remind me of the man I was before, the man I thought I'd lost forever." "I'm glad," Linda whispered, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. There were moments of shared laughter over some small domestic disaster, moments of quiet companionship as they worked side by side, moments of deeper connection when their eyes would meet across the room, and something electric would pass between them. But there were also moments of uncertainty, times when Linda would remember the circumstances of her arrival and wonder if what she felt was real or simply gratitude dressed up as something more. Edward, for his part, struggled with the knowledge that she had not come to him by choice, that the power dynamic between them made any advance on his part potentially coercive. "You know you're free to leave?" he said one evening, the words seeming to come from nowhere. "When spring comes, if you want to go, I won't stop you. I'll give you money, help you start over somewhere new." Linda looked up from her mending, surprised by the sudden declaration. "Do you want me to go?" "No," Edward said, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, no. But I need you to know that you have a choice. What we have here, what we're building together, it only means something if you're here because you want to be." Linda set down her sewing and moved to where Edward sat by the fire. She knelt beside his chair, her hand finding his, her eyes searching his face. "I want to be here," she said firmly. "Not because I have to be, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this feels like home. You feel like home." Edward's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "Linda," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "I know it's complicated," she said. "I know people would say I'm just grateful, or confused, or that I don't know my own mind. But I do know. I know that when I look at you, I see the man I want to build a life with. I know that when I think about leaving, my heart breaks a little. I know that what I feel for you is real." Edward's eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Finding none, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. "I love you," he said, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you too," Linda replied, and felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke, and the promise of something beautiful growing between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their hearts racing with the magnitude of what they had just acknowledged. "What happens now?" Linda asked, her voice shaky with emotion. "Now we see what we can build together," Edward replied, his arms coming around her to hold her close. "Now we stop being afraid of what we feel and start being grateful for it." The winter that had once seemed like a prison now became a cocoon, a protected space where their love could grow and strengthen without interference from the outside world. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing not just the work of survival, but the deeper intimacy of two people learning to trust completely. Edward taught Linda to hunt, to track game through the snow, and take a clean shot that would provide meat for their table. She proved to have a natural aptitude for it, her small size and quiet movements making her an effective hunter. In return, Linda brought to their isolated world a warmth and domesticity that transformed the cabin from a mere shelter into a true home. They talked long into the nights, sharing stories of their past, their dreams for the future, their fears and hopes, and everything in between. Edward spoke of his first wife with a sadness that had been tempered by time and healing, making it clear that what he felt for Linda was not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new and precious in its own right. Linda, for her part, found herself able to speak of her father's failures and her family's shame without the crushing weight of humiliation she had carried for so long. In Edward's eyes, she saw not judgment but understanding, not pity but respect for the strength she had shown in surviving her ordeal. "You could have broken," he told her one night as they lay together by the fire, her head pillowed on his chest. "What they did to you, what your father did, selling you like that, it could have destroyed you. But you didn't break. You bent, but you didn't break." "I wanted to," Linda admitted, her fingers tracing patterns on his shirt. "There were moments when I thought about just giving up, letting whatever was going to happen, happen, and not fighting anymore. But you didn't." "No." Something inside me refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was hope, maybe it was just too much anger to let them win. But I couldn't give up. Edward's arms tightened around her. "I'm grateful for that stubbornness," he said. I'm grateful for whatever it was that kept you fighting, because it brought you to me. As winter reached its deepest point, their love affair took on the quality of a fairy tale, two people finding perfect happiness in their mountain sanctuary. They made love with a passion that surprised them both, their bodies learning each other with the same careful attention they had given to the practical skills of mountain living. Edward was a generous and patient lover, taking time to worship Linda's body with a reverence that made her feel like something precious and beautiful, rather than the damaged goods she had sometimes believed herself to be. Under his touch, she bloomed like a flower in spring, discovering depths of desire and pleasure she had never imagined possible. For Edward, making love to Linda was a form of healing, a way of reclaiming the part of himself that had died with his first wife. Linda's passion, her generous response to his touch, her obvious delight in their physical connection, all served to remind him that he was still a man capable of giving and receiving love. They established routines and rituals that bound them together in ways both practical and profound. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, evening readings by the fire, the daily tasks of tending animals and maintaining their homestead. Each small act became a thread in the tapestry of their shared life, creating something strong and beautiful and uniquely their own. But even as they lost themselves in the joy of their newfound love, the world beyond their mountain sanctuary continued to turn. In Cedar Falls, tongues wagged about the mountain man and his purchased woman, speculation running wild about what might be happening in that isolated cabin. Some spoke with prurient interest, others with moral outrage, but all agreed that the situation was scandalous and somehow unnatural. Thomas Cruise, still smarting from being outbid at the auction, made it his business to spread the most damaging rumors he could invent. According to him, Edward Reed was a dangerous madman who had bought Linda Mendoza for the most depraved purposes imaginable. He painted lurid pictures of abuse and degradation, of a helpless woman trapped in the wilderness, with a man who saw her as nothing more than property to be used and discarded. "Mark my words," Cruise told anyone who would listen. "We'll find her body come spring. If we find anything at all. That mountain man's got a taste for violence, and a woman like that, bought at auction. Well, she's disposable, isn't she?" The rumors grew in the telling, each person adding their own embellishments until the story bore no resemblance to reality. Some claimed to have heard screams echoing from the mountain on still nights. Others swore they had seen smoke signals that could only be distress calls. A few even suggested that Edward Reed was practicing some form of dark magic up there, using Linda as a sacrifice to appease the mountain spirits. Victoria Gomez, the storekeeper's wife, found herself in the uncomfortable position of being one of the few people who had actually interacted with both Edward and Linda. She remembered the careful way Edward had selected warm clothes for Linda, the respectful manner in which he had treated her, the absence of any signs of fear or distress in the woman's demeanor. "They seemed normal," she told her husband one evening as they closed up the store. "Different, maybe, but not dangerous, not like people are saying." "People need something to talk about," Kenneth Murphy replied, counting the day's receipts. "Especially in winter when there's not much else happening. Come spring, they'll find something new to gossip about." But Kenneth was wrong. As winter began to give way to spring, the rumors about Edward Reed and Linda Mendoza only grew more virulent and widespread. Thomas Cruise had convinced a significant portion of the town that a terrible crime was being committed up on the mountain, and that it was their moral duty to intervene. "We can't just sit here and do nothing," Cruise declared at a town meeting held in the church basement. "That woman was one of ours, born and raised right here in Cedar Falls. We have a responsibility to her memory if nothing else." "You don't know that she's dead," protested Jacqueline Watson, one of the few voices of reason in the room. "You don't know anything except what you've made up in your own head." "I know what kind of man Edward Reed is," Cruise shot back. "I know what happens to women who disappear into the mountains with men like that, and I know that we'll all have blood on our hands if we don't act." The meeting grew heated, with roughly half the town supporting Cruise's call for action and the other half urging caution. In the end, no official decision was made, but the seeds of vigilante justice had been planted. Cruise began quietly recruiting like-minded individuals, men who shared his conviction that Edward Reed was a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped. Meanwhile, on the mountain, Edward and Linda remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in the valley below. They had emerged from winter stronger and more united than ever, their love having survived the test of isolation and hardship. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots of spring appeared, they made plans for the future with the confidence of two people who had found their place in the world. "We should expand the garden this year," Linda suggested one morning as they walked the perimeter of their property. "Maybe plant some fruit trees, build a proper root cellar." "I'd like that," Edward agreed, his arm around her waist as they surveyed their domain. "This place is starting to feel permanent, like something we're building to last." "It is permanent," Linda said firmly. "This is our home, our life. I can't imagine being anywhere else." Edward stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Linda, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've been thinking about all winter." Linda's heart began to race, sensing the importance of whatever was coming. "What is it?" Edward reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the morning light. It was a ring, simple but beautiful, carved from a piece of mountain jade he had found the previous summer. "I know the circumstances of how we met weren't conventional," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I know people might say this is all wrong, that we're moving too fast, or that what we have isn't real. But I know what I feel, and I know what I want. I want to marry you, Linda. I want to make this official, make you my wife in every sense of the word." Linda stared at the ring, tears blurring her vision. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, not because of its material value, but because of what it represented. "Edward," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to answer now," Edward said quickly, misinterpreting her silence. "I know it's a big decision, and you might need time to think about it. I just wanted you to know how I feel, what I'm hoping for." "Yes," Linda said, the word bursting out of her like water from a broken dam. "Yes, of course, yes. I want to marry you too. I want to be your wife. I want to build a life with you. I want everything." Edward's face broke into a grin that transformed his usually serious expression into something radiant and joyful. He slipped the ring onto Linda's finger, where it fit as perfectly as if it had been made for her, which in a sense it had been. They kissed then, long and deep and full of promise, sealing their engagement with all the passion and love they felt for each other. Around them, the mountain wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and wild and free, the perfect setting for their perfect moment. "When?" Linda asked when they finally broke apart. "Soon," Edward replied. "As soon as we can arrange it. Maybe we can convince the circuit preacher to come up here, or we could go down to town if you prefer." Linda's expression clouded slightly at the mention of town. She had been so happy on the mountain that she had almost forgotten about the world they had left behind, about the people who had witnessed her humiliation and might judge their unconventional courtship. "What is it?" Edward asked, noticing her change in mood. "The town," Linda said hesitantly. "People there. They know how we met, how you bought me at auction. They might not understand what we have now, might think it's all wrong somehow." Edward's jaw tightened, and for a moment Linda caught a glimpse of the dangerous man the townspeople believed him to be. "Let them think what they want," he said grimly. "Their opinions don't matter. What matters is what we know to be true. But if we go down there to get married, then we go down there with our heads held high," Edward interrupted. "We have nothing to be ashamed of, Linda. Nothing. What we have is real and good and beautiful, and anyone who can't see that is blind." Linda nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "You're right," she said. "We have nothing to hide, nothing to apologize for." They spent the rest of the morning making plans, discussing the practical details of their wedding and their future together. They would go to town the following week, Edward decided, to arrange for the ceremony and to pick up supplies they would need for the coming year. It would be Linda's first trip back to Cedar Falls since the auction, and while the prospect made her nervous, she was determined not to let fear rule her decisions. "We'll face them together," Edward promised, as if reading her thoughts. "Whatever they say, whatever they think, we'll face it together." The week passed quickly, filled with the usual tasks of mountain living, but colored by the excitement of their engagement. Linda found herself looking at their cabin with new eyes. seeing it not just as a refuge, but as the foundation of the family they would build together. She imagined children playing in the clearing, their laughter echoing off the mountain peaks, and the vision filled her with a happiness so intense it was almost painful. Edward, too, seemed transformed by their engagement, his usual seriousness giving way to moments of almost boyish joy. He would catch her looking at her ring and smile, or pull her into his arms for no reason other than the simple pleasure of holding her close. It was as if their decision to marry had freed them both from some invisible constraint, allowing them to fully embrace the love they felt. On the appointed day, they loaded their wagon with supplies for the trip and began the long journey down to Cedar Falls. The road was muddy from the spring melt, making travel slow and difficult, but neither of them minded. They were together, they were in love, and they were about to take the next step in their life together. As they crested the final hill before town, Linda felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. Below them, Cedar Falls spread out in the valley, looking smaller and shabbier than she remembered. Smoke rose from chimneys, people moved along the streets, and life continued much as it always had, but to Linda, it felt like entering a foreign country. Second thoughts? Edward asked gently, noticing her tension. No, Linda said firmly. No second thoughts. Just nervous, I suppose. It's been a long time. It'll be fine, Edward assured her. We'll get what we need and get back to the mountain. This is just a formality. But as they drove into town, it became clear that their arrival had not gone unnoticed. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Conversations ceased as they passed, and Linda could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. The attention was uncomfortable, but not entirely unexpected. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, determined to show no weakness. They stopped first at the general store, where Kenneth Murphy greeted them with professional courtesy if not warmth. Edward conducted his business efficiently, purchasing the supplies they needed while Linda waited by the wagon, acutely aware of the curious stares of passers-by. Quite a stir you're causing, Murphy commented as he tallied their purchases. People aren't sure what to make of you two. People never are sure what to make of things they don't understand, Edward replied evenly. Doesn't mean they need to understand, just means they need to mind their own business. Murphy's expression suggested he agreed, at least partially. For what it's worth, he said quietly. You both look well. Happy. That counts for something in my book. Thank you, Edward said, and meant it. It was the first genuinely kind word they had received since entering town. Their next stop was the church, where they hoped to find the preacher and arrange for their wedding ceremony. Reverend Scott Ramirez was a young man, new to the community, and he listened to their request with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with competing impulses. You want to be married, he said slowly, as if trying to understand the concept. Yes, Edward confirmed, as soon as possible. And you are. The preacher's eyes moved from Edward to Linda and back again, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. We're two people in love who want to make a commitment to each other, Linda said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. Isn't that what marriage is supposed to be about? Reverend Ramirez shifted in his chair, his discomfort evident. Yes, of course, but the circumstances. I mean, everyone knows how you... That is to say, everyone knows that Edward bought me at auction, Linda finished for him. Yes, that's true. But what everyone doesn't know is what happened after that. How we came to care for each other. How we built something real and good together. I'm not questioning your feelings, the preacher said quickly. It's just that some people in town have concerns, questions about whether this is appropriate. Edward's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke. What people? What concerns? Well, Thomas Cruz has been quite vocal about his opinions. He seems to think that Miss Mendoza might not be acting of her own free will, that she might be coerced somehow. 17 pauses. Linda felt anger flare in her chest, hot and righteous. Thomas Cruz, she said, her voice dripping with contempt, is a small-minded man who can't stand the thought that someone else got something he wanted. My decisions are my own, Reverend, and I resent the implication that I'm too weak or stupid to know my own mind. Of course, Reverend Ramirez said hastily. I didn't mean to suggest. Look, if you're both certain this is what you want, I'll perform the ceremony, but perhaps it would be better to do it quietly, without a lot of fanfare, given the unusual circumstances. Edward and Linda exchanged glances, communicating without words. They had hoped for a normal wedding, a celebration of their love. But it seemed that luxury would be denied them. Fine, Edward said curtly. When can you do it? Tomorrow morning if that suits you, early before most people are about. They agreed to the arrangement, though both felt a sting of disappointment at having to skulk around like criminals. As they left the church, Linda could see the tension in Edward's shoulders, the way his jaw was set in a hard line. I'm sorry, she said as they walked back to their wagon. For what? For making this difficult. If you had chosen someone else, someone without my history. Edward stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. Don't, he said, his voice intense. Don't ever apologize for who you are or where you came from. What we have is worth 100 times more than their approval, and I wouldn't trade you for all the respectable women in the world. His words warmed her heart, but Linda could still see the anger simmering in his eyes. She knew that Edward's protective instincts had been aroused, that he was struggling with the desire to defend her honor more forcefully. It was both touching and slightly frightening to see how fierce he could be when someone he loved was threatened. They spent the night at the town's small hotel, in separate rooms to avoid further gossip. Linda lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of town life. After months of mountain silence, the noise seemed overwhelming, a constant reminder that they no longer belonged in this world. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Linda's mood as she prepared for her wedding day. She had brought her best dress, a simple blue wool that Edward had bought for her during the winter, and she did her best to make herself presentable despite the circumstances. Edward was waiting for her in the hotel lobby, dressed in his finest clothes and looking handsome despite the tension that still marked his features. Ready? He asked, offering her his arm. Ready, Linda confirmed, though her stomach was churning with nervousness. The church was empty except for Reverend Ramirez and two witnesses he had recruited from among the more tolerant members of his congregation. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, lacking the joy and celebration that should have marked such an important moment. But when Edward slipped a simple gold band onto Linda's finger, when he looked into her eyes and promised to love and protect her for all the days of his life, when she made the same promise in return, none of the external circumstances mattered. They were married, united, not just in the eyes of God and the law, but in their own hearts and minds. You may kiss the bride, Reverend Ramirez said, and Edward did, thoroughly and without regard for their small audience. When they broke apart, both were smiling, the first genuine smiles either had worn since entering town. They were married, they were together, and they were ready to return to their mountain sanctuary and begin their life as husband and wife. But as they left the church, they found their path blocked by a small crowd of townspeople. Thomas Cruz stood at the front of the group, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. Well, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The mountain man and his whore, making it legal. Edward went very still beside Linda, and she could feel the dangerous tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. Choose your words carefully, Cruz, Edward said, his voice deadly quiet. Why should I? Cruz shot back, emboldened by the presence of his supporters. Everyone knows what she is, what you bought her for. Putting a ring on her finger doesn't change that. The crowd murmured agreement, and Linda felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and rage. These people, who had watched her father sell her like livestock, who had done nothing to help her in her darkest hour, now felt entitled to judge her happiness. You're right, Linda said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Everyone does know what I am. I'm a woman who survived something terrible and found love on the other side of it. I'm a woman who chose to build a life with a good man rather than let bitterness destroy me. I'm a woman who's not ashamed of where I came from or where I'm going. She stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. And you, Thomas Cruz, are a man who's so eaten up with jealousy and spite that you can't stand to see someone else find happiness. You're a man who would rather spread lies and poison than face the truth about your own failures. The crowd had gone silent, shocked by Linda's bold words. Cruz's face was red with anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think you're better than us now? He snarled. You think living in sin with that madman makes you respectable? I think living with love makes me richer than you'll ever be, Linda replied calmly. And I think it's time we left your sad little town behind and went home. She turned to Edward, who was looking at her with something like awe in his eyes. Shall we go, husband? Yes, Edward said, his voice thick with pride and love. Let's go home, wife. They walked to their wagon with dignity, ignoring the muttered comments and hostile stares of the crowd. As they drove out of town, Linda felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced her past, confronted her demons, and emerged victorious. Whatever happened now, she would never again be the broken, desperate woman who had stood on that auction block. The journey back to the mountain was peaceful, marked by a comfortable silence that spoke of deep contentment. They were married now, legally and officially bound together, and the knowledge filled them both with quiet joy. I'm proud of you, Edward said as they climbed toward their home. The way you stood up to them, the way you spoke, your truth. You were magnificent. I had to, Linda replied. I couldn't let them make me feel ashamed of what we have. It's too precious for that. It is precious, Edward agreed. The most precious thing in my life. They reached their cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The familiar sight of their home, nestled among the pines with smoke curling from the chimney, filled them both with a sense of peace and belonging. Welcome home, Mrs. Reed, Edward said, helping Linda down from the wagon. Thank you, Mr. Reed, Linda replied, her heart full of happiness. It's good to be home. That night, they made love as husband and wife for the first time, their union blessed by law and sanctified by the depth of their feeling for each other. It was tender and passionate and perfect, a celebration of everything they had overcome and everything they had built together. In the weeks that followed, they settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Their routines remained largely the same, but everything felt different somehow, more permanent and secure. They were no longer two people who had found each other by chance, but a married couple building a future together. Edward began work on expanding their cabin, adding rooms that would accommodate the children they both hoped for. Linda threw herself into improving their homestead, planting a larger garden and establishing the domestic comforts that would make their mountain home truly complete. They were happy, perhaps happier than either had ever been, and for a while it seemed as if their troubles were behind them. The town and its narrow-minded inhabitants felt very far away, irrelevant to the life they were building together. But peace, Linda was learning, was often fragile, and happiness could be threatened by forces beyond one's control. The first sign of trouble came on a warm evening in late spring, when Edward returned from a hunting trip with a grim expression and troubling news. There were men in the woods today, he told Linda as they sat down to dinner. 3 of them, maybe 4. They were trying to stay hidden, but I caught sight of them watching the cabin. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. Who were they? Could you tell? I recognized one of them. Dennis Castillo, works for Thomas Cruz. The others I didn't know, but they had the look of men up to no good. What do you think they wanted? Edward's expression was dark. Nothing good. Cruz has been spreading his poison all winter, and now that we're married, he probably sees it as some kind of personal insult. Men like him don't like to be shown up, especially not by people they consider beneath them. Linda reached across the table and took Edward's hand. What do we do? We stay alert, Edward replied. We make sure we're never caught off guard, and if they come here looking for trouble, we give them more than they bargained for. The threat hung over them like a storm cloud, coloring their days with tension and uncertainty. Edward began carrying his rifle everywhere, even when doing simple chores around the homestead. Linda found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, her nerves stretched tight with worry. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Linda was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching at speed. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran toward the house, but she was too late. 4 men on horseback burst into the clearing, their faces covered with bandanas, their intentions clear. There she is! One of them shouted, and Linda recognized the voice as belonging to Dennis Castillo, despite the mask that covered his features. Get her! Linda ran, her heart pounding with terror, but the men on horseback were faster. Strong hands grabbed her, lifted her struggling form, and threw her across a saddle like a sack of grain. She screamed for Edward. praying he would hear her, praying he would come in time. Edward did hear her screams, and he came running from the woods where he had been checking his traps. But the sight that greeted him filled him with a rage so pure and terrible that it seemed to burn away everything else. His wife was being carried off by masked men, her cries of fear and pain echoing off the mountain peaks. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing like thunder through the clearing. One of the riders cried out and slumped in his saddle, but the others pressed on, carrying Linda away into the forest. Edward ran for his horse, his mind focused on only one thing: getting his wife back, no matter what it cost. The chase that followed was wild and desperate, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out among the towering pines. Edward knew these mountains better than anyone, knew every trail and hiding place, and he used that knowledge to his advantage. He was able to get ahead of the kidnappers, to set up an ambush that would give him the best chance of rescuing Linda without getting her killed in the crossfire. When the moment came, Edward struck with the precision of a hunting wolf. His first shot took down the lead rider, sending him tumbling from his horse. His second shot shattered the shoulder of another man, causing him to release his grip on Linda's struggling form. Linda hit the ground hard but rolled to her feet immediately, her survival instincts taking over. She ran toward Edward, dodging between the panicked horses and cursing men, her only thought to reach the safety of her husband's arms. "Linda!" Edward called, and she turned toward his voice just as Dennis Castillo raised his pistol and took aim at her fleeing form. Edward's third shot took Castillo in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the forest floor. The remaining kidnapper, seeing his companions dead or wounded, spurred his horse and fled into the darkness, leaving his fallen comrades behind. Edward caught Linda as she threw herself into his arms, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief. She was bruised and frightened, but essentially unharmed, and Edward held her close, whispering words of comfort and love, while his eyes scanned the forest for any sign of further threat. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. I've got you." But even as he spoke the words, Edward knew they weren't true. This attack had been just the beginning, a test of their defenses and their resolve. Thomas Cruise and his allies would not give up easily, and the war for their peaceful mountain sanctuary had only just begun. They returned to their cabin to find it ransacked, their belongings scattered and broken, their home violated by the same men who had tried to steal Linda away. The sight filled them both with a mixture of grief and rage, but also with a steely determination to fight back. "We can't stay here," Edward said, surveying the damage. "Not tonight, maybe not for a while. They'll be back, probably with more men." "Where will we go?" Linda asked, though she already knew the answer. "Deeper into the mountains," Edward replied. "There are places up there that no town man would dare to go, places where we can wait out the storm and plan our next move." They gathered what supplies they could salvage and loaded them onto their horses, preparing to abandon the home they had built together. It was a bitter moment, made worse by the knowledge that they were being driven out by hatred and ignorance. As they rode away from their cabin, Linda looked back one last time at the place where she had found love and happiness. The windows were dark, the chimney cold, and the garden she had tended so carefully was trampled and ruined. "We'll be back," Edward promised, seeing the grief in her eyes. "When this is over, we'll come back and rebuild. We'll make it even better than it was before." "Will it ever be over?" Linda asked, her voice small and tired. "Yes," Edward said with absolute certainty. "One way or another, it will be over. And when it is, we'll be free to live our lives in peace." They rode through the night, climbing ever higher into the wild heart of the mountains. Behind them, smoke rose from the valley, where their enemies plotted and schemed. Ahead lay uncertainty and danger, but also the promise of sanctuary in the high country that Edward knew so well. As dawn broke over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Linda felt her spirits begin to lift despite everything they had lost. She was alive, Edward was alive, and they were together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, as partners united by love and strengthened by shared adversity. The hideout Edward led them to was a cave high in the mountains, concealed behind a waterfall and accessible only by a narrow ledge that required careful navigation. It was not comfortable, but it was safe, and safety was what they needed most. "How did you find this place?" Linda asked as they settled their horses and unpacked their supplies. "I found it during my first winter on the mountain," Edward replied. "I was hunting and got caught in a blizzard. This cave saved my life then, and it might save both our lives now." They made camp in the cave's depths, building a small fire for warmth and light. The sound of the waterfall masked any noise they might make, and the narrow entrance could be easily defended if their enemies somehow managed to track them this far. For 3 days they remained hidden, waiting and watching for any sign of pursuit. Edward ventured out periodically to scout the surrounding area, but he saw no indication that they had been followed. It seemed that Thomas Cruise and his remaining allies were content to let them disappear into the wilderness, perhaps hoping that the mountains themselves would finish what they had started. On the 4th day, Edward returned from one of his scouting expeditions with news that changed everything. "There's been a fire," he told Linda, his face grim with the implications. "Down in the valley, near our cabin, I could see the smoke from the ridge." Linda's heart clenched with fear. "Our home?" "I don't know," Edward admitted. "The smoke was too thick to see clearly, but it's coming from the right area." They both knew what this meant. Whether by accident or design, the cabin they had built together, the sanctuary where their love had flourished, might now be nothing more than ashes and memories. "We have to go back," Linda said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "It might be a trap," Edward warned. "They might be waiting for us to return." "Then we'll be careful," Linda replied. "But we have to know. We can't hide up here forever, wondering what's left of our life." Edward nodded, understanding her need to see for herself what had become of their home. They had built something beautiful together, and even if it was gone, they deserved to mourn its passing properly. The journey back down the mountain was tense and cautious, with Edward constantly alert for any sign of ambush. But the forest seemed empty of human presence, as if the violence of the past few days had driven away even the most determined of their enemies. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking their homestead, both Linda and Edward stopped in shocked silence. Their cabin still stood, but barely. The roof had partially collapsed, the walls were blackened with soot, and the windows were nothing more than empty holes staring blindly across the clearing. "Oh, Edward," Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. Edward's jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes burning with controlled fury. "They did this," he said quietly. "After they failed to take you, they came back and tried to destroy everything we built." Linda wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll build it again," she said with quiet determination. "We'll make it stronger than before." Edward looked at her with admiration and love. Even in the face of such devastation, she refused to be broken. Her strength gave him strength. Her determination fueled his own resolve. "Yes," he agreed. "We'll build it again. But first, we need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to end this, once and for all." They made their way down to the ruined cabin, picking through the debris to see what could be salvaged. Much of their furniture was destroyed, but some of their books had survived, along with a few precious mementos of their time together. As they worked, Linda found herself thinking about the people who had done this, about the hatred and fear that had driven them to such extremes. She tried to understand it, tried to find some way to forgive, but the senseless destruction of their home made forgiveness difficult. "Why do they hate us so much?" she asked Edward as they sorted through the wreckage. Edward paused in his work, considering the question carefully. "Because we represent something they don't understand," he said finally. "Because we found happiness in a way that doesn't fit their narrow view of how the world should work. Because we prove that love can grow in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people." Is that so threatening? To people like Thomas Cruise, yes. Our happiness makes their own lives seem smaller, more constrained. Our love challenges everything they believe about proper behavior and social order. They can't stand the thought that we might be right and they might be wrong. Linda nodded, beginning to understand. Their love story was more than just a personal triumph. It was a challenge to the established order, a proof that the rules society lived by were not as absolute as everyone believed. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We fight," Edward said simply. "Not with violence, unless they force us to it, but with the simple act of continuing to exist, continuing to love each other, continuing to build our life together." We show them that their hatred can't destroy what we have. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the clearing. Edward and Linda looked up to see a group of riders emerging from the tree line, but these were not the masked men who had attacked them before. These were official representatives of the law, led by Sheriff Kenneth Murphy and accompanied by several deputies. "Edward Reed," the sheriff called as he dismounted. "Linda Reed, we need to talk." Edward stepped protectively in front of Linda, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What about, Sheriff?" "About Dennis Castillo," Murphy replied. "About the charges that have been filed against you for his murder." Linda felt the world tilt around her. In all their planning and worry, they had not considered this possibility, that Edward's defense of his wife might be twisted into something criminal. "Murder," Edward said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I defended my wife against kidnappers. I defended my home against criminals." "That's your side of the story," Murphy acknowledged. "But Thomas Cruz tells it differently. He says you lured those men into an ambush, that you killed Dennis in cold blood." "Thomas Cruz is a liar," Linda said, stepping up beside her husband. "He's the one who sent those men after us. He's the one who ordered them to kidnap me." Murphy's expression suggested he had doubts about Cruz's version of events, but he was bound by his duty to investigate. "Be that as it may, charges have been filed. You'll need to come with us, Edward, to face a judge and jury." Edward's hand tightened on his weapon, and for a moment Linda feared he might try to fight his way out. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and she knew he had reached the same conclusion she had. Running would only make things worse. "All right," Edward said quietly. "I'll come with you. But I want your word that my wife will be protected while I'm gone." "You have it," Murphy promised. "She can stay in town, at the hotel, until this is sorted out." Linda grabbed Edward's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she said. "I won't be separated from you again. If you go to jail, I go too." "Linda, be reasonable," Edward said gently. "You'll be safer in town, and this won't last long. Once the truth comes out, I'll be free." But Linda had learned not to trust in the fairness of the world, had learned that truth was often less powerful than prejudice and fear. She knew that Edward was walking into a trap, that the trial would be a sham designed to give Thomas Cruz's revenge a veneer of legality. "Promise me," she whispered, gripping his hands tightly. "Promise me you'll fight. Promise me you won't give up, no matter what they say or do." "I promise," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll come back to you, Linda. Whatever it takes, I'll come back." They kissed then, long and desperate, knowing it might be their last moment together for a very long time. When they finally broke apart, both had tears in their eyes, but both were determined to be strong. Edward surrendered his weapons to the sheriff and allowed himself to be placed in shackles, though Murphy had the grace to look embarrassed by the necessity. As the party prepared to leave for town, Linda made a decision that would change everything. "I'm coming with you," she announced, mounting her horse with grim determination. "Linda, no," Edward protested. "It's not safe. Stay here. Stay hidden until this is over." "My place is with you," Linda replied firmly. "In good times and bad, remember? We're married now, and that means we face everything together." Sheriff Murphy looked uncomfortable with the arrangement, but didn't try to stop her. Perhaps he understood that separating them would be both cruel and pointless, or perhaps he simply didn't want to deal with the complications that would arise from trying to force Linda to stay behind. The journey to Cedar Falls was a nightmare of whispered conversations and hostile stares. Word of Edward's arrest had spread quickly, and by the time they reached town, a crowd had gathered to witness his humiliation. Thomas Cruz stood at the front of the mob, his face twisted with malicious satisfaction. "There's the murderer," he called out as they passed. "There's the man who gunned down Dennis Castillo in cold blood." Edward kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give Cruz the satisfaction of a response. But Linda could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched with suppressed rage. The jail was a small, dark building that smelled of sweat and despair. Edward was locked in a cell barely large enough to hold a single cot, while Linda was forced to watch from the other side of iron bars that might as well have been 1,000 miles. "I'll get you a lawyer," Linda promised, though she had no idea how she would pay for one. "Save your money," Edward replied grimly. "In this town, With these people, a lawyer won't make much difference. But Linda refused to accept defeat so easily. Over the next few days, she threw herself into preparing Edward's defense with the same determination she had once applied to learning the skills of mountain living. She interviewed witnesses, gathered evidence, and tried to build a case that would prove Edward's innocence. What she found was a conspiracy of silence and lies that went deeper than she had imagined. The surviving members of the kidnapping party had been coached in their testimony, their stories carefully crafted to paint Edward as the aggressor. Thomas Cruise had used his wealth and influence to ensure that only his version of events would be heard in court. "It's hopeless," Jacqueline Watson told Linda when she came seeking support. "Cruise owns half the people in this town, and the other half are too scared to cross him. Your husband doesn't have a chance." But Linda had not survived everything she had endured by accepting hopelessness. If the system was rigged against them, then she would find another way to fight. If the truth couldn't be heard in a courtroom, then she would make sure it was heard elsewhere. She began writing letters, dozens of them, to newspapers in larger cities, to territorial officials, to anyone who might listen to their story. She told the truth about the auction, about their love, about the kidnapping, and the conspiracy that now threatened to destroy them both. Most of her letters went unanswered, but a few found sympathetic ears. A reporter from the territorial capital became interested in the story, particularly the allegations of corruption and vigilante justice. A federal marshal began asking questions about the conduct of local law enforcement. As word of the case spread beyond Cedar Falls, the simple narrative that Thomas Cruise had constructed began to unravel. People in other towns and cities had no investment in the local power structure, no reason to accept Cruise's version of events without question. The trial, when it finally began, was a circus of conflicting testimonies and heated accusations. Cruise's witnesses told their rehearsed stories, painting Edward as a dangerous madman who had murdered an innocent man. But Linda's efforts had borne fruit, and Edward's defenders were able to present evidence of the conspiracy against them. The most damaging testimony came from Scott Ramirez, the circuit preacher who had married them. Under oath, he admitted that Thomas Cruise had approached him before the wedding, offering money to refuse to perform the ceremony. He said it was unnatural, Ramirez testified reluctantly. He said that Edward Reed had bought her like a slave and that no Christian minister should sanctify such an arrangement. "But you performed the ceremony anyway," Edward's lawyer pressed. "Yes," Ramirez admitted. "Because when I spoke to them, when I saw them together, I could see that what they had was real. Whatever the circumstances of their meeting, they genuinely loved each other." The testimony created a sensation in the courtroom, and Linda could see doubt beginning to creep into the faces of some jury members. But Cruise was not finished yet, and he had one more card to play. On the final day of the trial, Cruise took the stand himself, presenting himself as a concerned citizen who had tried to save Linda from a terrible fate. His testimony was polished and persuasive, designed to appeal to the prejudices and fears of the jury. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with false sincerity, "we all know what kind of man Edward Reed is. A hermit, a misfit who turned his back on civilized society. When he bought that poor woman at auction, we all knew what he intended to do with her. And when good men tried to rescue her from her degradation, he killed them for it." Linda felt sick listening to Cruise twist the truth into something ugly and hateful. But when the prosecutor finished his questioning and Edward's lawyer began his cross-examination, Cruise's composure began to crack. "Mr. Cruise," the lawyer said, "you testified that you were concerned for Mrs. Reed's welfare. Is that why you bid against Mr. Reed at the auction?" Yes. I thought I could provide her with proper employment, a chance to rebuild her life respectably." "I see. And this proper employment would have involved what, exactly?" Cruise shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Domestic work, of course. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Nothing else?" "I don't know what you're implying." The lawyer produced a document from his briefcase, holding it up for the jury to see. "This is a contract, Mr. Cruise, drawn up by your lawyer the day before the auction. It outlines the terms of employment for a female servant. Would you like me to read the relevant sections aloud?" Cruise's face went white, and Linda could see sweat beading on his forehead. That's just a standard contract. A standard contract that gives you the right to determine where she lives, who she associates with, and what she does with her free time. A contract that essentially makes her your property in everything but name. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, and the judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Linda felt a surge of hope as she saw the disgust on several jurors' faces, but the most powerful testimony came from Linda herself. When she took the stand, she spoke with quiet dignity about her life before the auction, about the desperation that had led to her father's decision, and about the love she had found with Edward. "I know what people think about me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I know they see a woman who was bought and sold like livestock, and they assume I must be broken, damaged, somehow less than human. But I'm here to tell you that love can grow anywhere, even in the darkest circumstances." Edward Reed didn't buy a slave or a possession. He bought a chance for both of us to find happiness, and we took that chance and made something beautiful from it. She looked directly at Thomas Cruise as she continued. "There are people in this town who can't stand the thought that we found joy together, who would rather see us destroyed than admit that their narrow view of the world might be wrong. They call it justice, but it's really just hatred dressed up in fancy clothes." When Linda stepped down from the witness stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, and even some of Cruz's supporters looked uncomfortable with their cause. The jury deliberated for 2 days, their discussions growing heated as they struggled to reconcile the conflicting narratives they had heard. In the end, they returned a verdict that satisfied no one completely, but acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Edward was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of manslaughter, a compromise verdict that recognized both his right to defend his wife and the fact that a man had died by his hand. The judge, clearly uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, sentenced him to time served and ordered his immediate release. As Edward walked out of the courthouse a free man, Linda threw herself into his arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. They had won, not completely but enough to reclaim their lives and their future together. But their victory came at a cost. The trial had divided the town, creating bitter resentments that would last for years. Thomas Cruise, his reputation in ruins, left Cedar Falls shortly after the verdict was announced, but the damage he had done would not be easily repaired. "What now?" Linda asked as they stood outside the courthouse, watching the crowd disperse. "Now we go home," Edward replied, his arm tight around her waist. "We rebuild what was destroyed, and we live our lives the way we choose to live them." The journey back to their mountain sanctuary was different from any they had made before. They were no longer running from something, but returning to claim what was rightfully theirs. The burned cabin awaited them, a symbol of both destruction and resilience, ready to be transformed once again into a home. Over the following months, they worked together to rebuild not just their cabin, but their entire life. The new structure was larger and stronger than the old one, with better defenses and more comfortable accommodations. It was a home built by two people who had learned the value of what they had together, who were determined never to take their happiness for granted again. Linda's garden flourished in the mountain soil, providing them with fresh vegetables and herbs that made their simple meals into feasts. Edward's hunting and trapping brought in enough meat to see them through the winter, along with furs that could be traded for the few supplies they couldn't produce themselves. But perhaps most importantly, their love continued to grow and deepen, strengthened by the trials they had endured together. They had faced the worst that the world could throw at them and emerged not just intact but stronger than before. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant shades of red and gold, Linda discovered that she was carrying Edward's child. The news filled them both with a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate everything around them. "A baby," Edward whispered, his hand resting gently on Linda's still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Linda asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Edward replied, pulling her into his arms. Terrified, excited, grateful, amazed, but mostly just incredibly happy. They spent the long winter months preparing for their child's arrival, Edward crafting a cradle from mountain pine, while Linda sewed tiny clothes and blankets. They talked endlessly about names and futures, about the kind of parents they wanted to be and the kind of world they wanted to create for their son or daughter. The baby was born on a clear spring morning, with the sun streaming through the cabin windows and the sound of birdsong filling the air. It was a daughter, perfect and healthy, with Edward's dark eyes and Linda's determined chin. "What shall we call her?" Edward asked, cradling the tiny bundle in his large, gentle hands. "Hope," Linda said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." And Hope she was, in every sense of the word. She represented not just their future, but their triumph over everything that had tried to destroy them. She was proof that love could indeed conquer hatred, that happiness could be built even from the darkest beginnings. As the years passed, their little family grew and thrived in their mountain sanctuary. Hope was joined by two brothers, Thomas and Samuel, named for men who had shown them kindness when kindness was rare. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, becoming a place of laughter and love that seemed to glow with contentment. Edward proved to be a devoted father, teaching his children the skills they would need to survive in the mountains, while also ensuring they received a proper education from the books that filled his shelves. Linda became the heart of their home, creating traditions and memories that would last their children's lifetimes. The town below gradually forgot about the scandal that had once consumed it, new gossip replacing old, new crises demanding attention. Occasionally, travelers would pass through their valley, and some would stop to trade or ask for directions. These visitors often remarked on the obvious happiness of the family they encountered, the way the parents looked at each other with undimmed love, the way the children played and laughed with complete security in their parents' affection. "You're lucky," a traveling merchant told Linda one day as she served him coffee on their porch. "Not many people find what you have here." "See, it wasn't luck," Linda replied, watching Edward teach their youngest son to whittle a piece of wood. "It was choice. Every day, we choose to love each other, to build something good together, to focus on what we have instead of what we've lost." The merchant nodded thoughtfully. "Still, it must have been difficult, starting from, well, from the circumstances people talk about. In Mikely and 70 Haber, we have related be in the bottom." Linda's expression grew serious. "The circumstances don't matter as much as what you do with them," she said. "Edward and I could have let our beginning define us, could have let other people's opinions determine our worth. Instead, we decided to write our own story." As their children grew older, Linda and Edward made sure they understood their family's history, the challenges their parents had overcome to build the life they all enjoyed. They told the story honestly, but with emphasis on the love and determination that had carried them through, teaching their children that adversity could be overcome and that happiness was something you created, not something you waited to receive. Hope, now a young woman of 17, often asked her parents about their early days together, fascinated by the romance and drama of their courtship. "Weren't you scared, Mama?" she asked one evening as they sat together, mending clothes. "When those men took you, when Papa was arrested, weren't you terrified that you'd lose everything?" "Terrified," Linda confirmed, "but also determined. I had found something precious with your father, something worth fighting for. Fear can paralyze you, or it can motivate you to fight harder than you ever thought possible. And you chose to fight. We both did. Your father could have given up when they arrested him, could have accepted that the world was against us. I could have run away when things got dangerous, could have decided it was too hard to love someone under such circumstances. But we chose each other, again and again, no matter what the cost." Hope smiled, her young face glowing with admiration for her parents. "I want to find love like that someday." "Sit down." "You will," Linda assured her. "Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same challenges, but you'll find your own version of it. And when you do, remember what your father and I learned. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision you make every day." Edward, listening from his chair by the fire, felt his heart swell with pride and gratitude. The broken woman who had stood on that auction block 20 years ago had become this wise, strong mother, this partner who had helped him build a legacy that would outlast them both. Their love story had become legend in the surrounding area, told and retold by travelers and traders who passed through the mountains. Some versions were more accurate than others, but all captured the essential truth that two unlikely people had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something beautiful together. As Linda and Edward entered their later years, their hair now silver and their faces lined with decades of mountain weather, they often sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the peaks that had sheltered their love for so long. "Do you ever regret it?" Edward asked one such evening, his hand finding hers with the automatic gesture of long habit. "The way it all started, the price we both paid?" Linda considered the question seriously, as she always did when Edward asked something important. Around them, their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter echoing off the mountains, while their own children worked to prepare the evening meal. "How can I regret the path that led me to all this?" she said finally, gesturing to encompass their family, their home, their life together. "If I hadn't been sold at that auction, if you hadn't been there to buy me, none of this would exist. Our children wouldn't exist. Our grandchildren wouldn't exist. All the love we've shared, all the happiness we've created, it all started with that terrible day." She turned to look at him, her eyes still bright despite the years. "I think sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. Our love didn't happen in spite of how we met. It happened because of it. We both knew what it was like to lose everything, to be desperate and alone. That knowledge made us treasure what we found together even more." Edward nodded, understanding completely. "The town thought they were watching a tragedy unfold," he said. "A woman sold into slavery, a hermit buying himself a servant. They couldn't see what we were really building. They couldn't see it because they didn't want to," Linda replied. "It challenged everything they believed about how the world worked, about who deserved happiness and who didn't. Our love was inconvenient for their narrow view of morality. And now?" Linda smiled, thinking of the occasional visitors they still received. People who came not to judge but to see for themselves the family that had grown from such unlikely beginnings. "Now they tell our story to their children as an example of how love can triumph over adversity," she said. "Now we're proof that happiness doesn't depend on circumstances, it depends on choices." As night fell over their mountain sanctuary, Linda and Edward sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of their family preparing for sleep. 3 generations lived under their roof now, bound together by love and the shared understanding that what they had was precious and worth protecting. The auction block where their story began had long since rotted away, replaced by newer structures as the town below continued to grow and change. Thomas Cruise was dead, his hatred buried with him, and most of the people who had witnessed Linda's humiliation were also gone, their gossip and judgment forgotten. But the love that had grown from that dark day continued to flourish, spreading through their children and grandchildren like ripples in a pond. Each new generation carried forward the lessons Linda and Edward had learned, that love is a choice, that happiness is something you build, and that the circumstances of your beginning don't have to determine the quality of your ending. "Tell me the story again, Grandmama," little Sarah, Hope's daughter, had asked just the week before. "Tell me about the mountain man who bought you at the auction." And Linda had told it again, as she had told it countless times before, emphasizing not the pain and humiliation of that day, but the love and determination that had grown from it. She told it as a love story, which it was, and as a story of triumph, which it also was. "The most important thing to remember," Linda always concluded, "is that your story isn't over until you stop writing it. No matter what happens to you, no matter how dark things seem, you always have the power to choose what comes next." Now, as they prepared to go inside for the night, Edward helped Linda to her feet with the same gentle care he had shown her on that first day when he had helped her down from the auction platform. His touch was still careful, still respectful, still filled with wonder that she had chosen to love him back. "Ready for bed, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, using the formal address that had become a private joke between them over the years. "Ready, Mr. Reed," Linda replied, her smile holding all the warmth and affection of their decades together. As they walked into their cabin, past the photographs of their children and grandchildren, past the books that had sustained them through long winters, past all the accumulated treasures of a life well lived, Linda reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. She had been sold like livestock at a public auction, purchased by a man she had never met, taken to a mountain cabin to face an unknown future. It should have been the end of her story, the final chapter in a tale of loss and degradation. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything beautiful in her life. The mountain man who had bought her at auction had given her not just freedom but love, not just shelter but a home, not just survival but a reason to thrive. In return, she had given him her heart, her loyalty, and her unwavering faith that what they had built together was worth any price they had to pay. Their love story had scandalized a town, survived a conspiracy, weathered a trial, and emerged stronger than ever. It had produced children and grandchildren who carried their values forward into the world. It had become legend, inspiration, proof that love could indeed conquer all. As Linda settled into bed beside the man who had been her husband for over 20 years, she thought about the young woman she had once been, standing on that auction block with terror in her heart and no hope for the future. That woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love that would transform her, the family that would grow from her darkest moment. "I love you," Edward whispered in the darkness, the same words he had spoken to her thousands of times before, but which never lost their power to move her. "I love you too," Linda whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Outside their window, the mountains stood sentinel over their valley, unchanged and unchanging, witness to all the seasons of their love. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow, of all the tomorrows yet to come. And in the cabin that love had built, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that what they had created together would outlast them both, a testament to the power of love, to transform even the darkest beginnings into the brightest of endings. The mountain man had bought her at auction, and what he had done next had indeed made the whole town whisper. But the whispers had changed over the years, from scandal to admiration, from judgment to wonder. They had whispered about the love that had grown between the hermit and the purchased woman, about the family they had built, about the legacy they had created. And in the end, that was the only whisper that mattered. The whisper of a love story that had defied all odds and created something beautiful from something broken, something eternal from something that was meant to be temporary, something sacred from something the world had deemed profane. The mountain man had bought her at auction, and what he had done next had changed both their lives forever. He had offered her not ownership but partnership, not servitude but love, not an ending but a beginning that would echo through generations. And Linda Mendoza, who had become Linda Reed, who had transformed from victim to survivor to beloved wife and mother, knew that she would choose the same path again, would walk through the same darkness to reach the same light, would pay the same price to receive the same reward. For in the end, love was worth any price, any struggle, any sacrifice. And what they had built together on their mountain, what they had created from the ashes of their separate despairs, was proof that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest chapters. The auction was over. The mountain man had made his choice, and the whispers had become songs of celebration for a love that had conquered all.